Hello everyone, we are at the final chapter in this course. In this video, we'll be covering chapter 17, Inflation, Unemployment, and the Federal Reserve Policy. This lecture will be a little shorter than some of the other ones because you should be familiar with these topics before. We had specific chapters over each one of these topics, but in this chapter we'll be actually introducing a new model, the Phillips curves, that ties together the unemployment rate and the inflation rate. What the Phillips curve does is it somewhat models the short-run relationship between unemployment rate and the inflation rate. So we're going to go ahead and write out that this is the Phillips curve here. And again, here you see short-run relationship, unemployment rate, inflation rate. So let's kind of rewind back towards 2019, before the coronavirus caused global economic disruption. Unemployment rates, specifically in the US, were fairly low, salaries were increasing, but the labor costs were causing firms to incur higher wage costs. And so real GDP growth wasn't exactly growing at a fast rate. So what President Trump at the time did was to try to encourage Jerome Powell, the Fed, to cut interest rates. But what happens when you cut interest rates is you do risk there being increased inflation. So kind of let's try to explain why there is a relationship between unemployment and inflation. So that's why we're using the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve is developed by a New Zealand economist, Phillips. Surprisingly, they always name these curves after whoever first identified the relationship. And it is a downward sloping curve. On our y-axis, we have the inflation rate, and our x-axis, we have the unemployment rate. So if we think back to our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, which we're showing right here in this graph, we have an upward sloping SRAS curve, and we have a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. So we can see if there was a small increase in aggregate demand, it leads to low inflation and high unemployment. But, so that would be like shifting from AD1 to AD2. However, if we shift from AD1 to AD3, we can see a lower unemployment rate, but more inflation. So a stronger AD shift will cause lower unemployment and more inflation. So we can kind of see how I graph that over to our curve here. And so correspondingly, we have our 3 points on our short run Phillips curve that shows a downward sloping Phillips curve. As aggregate demand shifts more, we have a lower unemployment rate. So you can see from this was showing the aggregate demand shift 1, and this was showing an aggregate demand shift 2. So we can see how, aggregate demand shift 3, we can see how it has a lower quantity of unemployment than the second shift. Okay, so is this really explanatory of what actually is happening? So there's been some arguments as far as if the Phillips curve is actually a realistic model, like does it actually pan out in real life? And back in the 1960s, which was forever ago, that relationship appeared to be pretty stable. And so policymakers could essentially choose a point on the Phillips curve and then essentially trade higher inflation for lower unemployment and vice versa. But what happened is it didn't turn out to be true, and sometimes allowing more inflation doesn't necessarily lead to permanently lower unemployment. So what happened eventually was in the 1960s, late 1960s, economists agreed that there was a long-run aggregate supply curve that was vertical, which we have talked about here. We have a long-run LRAS curve. That was then subsequently, the argument became, if there's a long-run aggregate supply curve that is vertical, then there must be an implication that the long-run Phillips curve is also vertical, which means essentially in the long run, employment is determined by output rather than being determined by price level. Just like we kind of talked about with the long-run aggregate supply level, we said that it was not determined or related to price level. It was determined by output. So, since employment is determined by potential GDP, so must unemployment. Unemployment in the long run, it goes to the natural rate of unemployment here. And that is where output is equal to potential GDP. At this point in time, the natural rate of unemployment, we don't have any cyclical unemployment. Remember, natural rate of unemployment only includes structural and frictional unemployment. And these two are not predictably affected by inflation. So unemployment in the long run, it goes to the natural rate of unemployment. Which, remember, this is our macroeconomic equilibrium. I'll shorten this. And so a vertical long-run aggregate supply curve must mean or infer that we have a vertical long-run Phillips curve. So the short-run Phillips curve is downward sloping. The long-run Phillips curve is going to be vertical. So the PowerPoint talks a little bit about the role of expectations of future inflation. We're not going to get too much into it, but essentially we can talk about the basis for the short-run Phillips curve is if actual inflation is greater than expected, then our actual real wage will be less than the expected real wage, and unemployment will fall. Conversely, if the actual inflation is if the actual inflation is less than expected, then actual real wage will be greater than expected real wage, and unemployment then will rise. So essentially there's going to be a trade-off between inflation and unemployment, and there's not a permanent trade-off. A temporary trade-off doesn't necessarily come from inflation, according to Milton Friedman, but it comes from unanticipated inflation. So really the problem is when inflation becomes unanticipated or it starts to get out of control, then we run into issues. Prices are off, wages aren't adjusting, and that's kind of what some of the fear is with this influx in economic stimulus that's occurred over the past year and a half or so. So some of you are writing about that in your paper, and I'll be very curious to see kind of what your take on the inflation situation is, especially since the Fed has announced it plans to keep interest rates low. So one quick question is, do workers understand inflation? Typically, workers don't necessarily believe increases in inflation quickly result in increases in wages. Essentially, they think that if they expect inflation, that will decrease their purchasing power for years over time. And so, because workers kind of tend to think that, they don't expect their wages to increase with inflation. Firms can increase wages by less than inflation, and then workers won't quit and their morale won't fall. So that's why higher inflation tends to lead to lower short-run unemployment. So I'm not going to get into necessarily how the short-run Phillips curve and the long-run Phillips curve interact, but understand that you can put both of them on the same model and kind of analyze how over time, if workers demand higher wages to compensate for increased inflation, then the economy eventually will return to potential GDP and will return to the natural rate of unemployment. So as the short run curve shifts with expected inflation rate, then you will have different rates of inflation intersecting on the long run Phillips curve. One question is, does the natural rate of unemployment ever change? You have demographic changes, changes in labor market institutions, and potentially high rates of past unemployment. So natural rate might change if the amounts of frictional and structural unemployment changed. So thinking about demographically, as older workers start to retire, then you may see an increase in employment as younger workers become more educated and move into those higher jobs. As the labor market institution changes, unemployment insurance becomes more available, which has happened, then you might see a move towards more people staying unemployed rather than pursuing these jobs. And then past rates of high unemployment. When a worker is unemployed for a long period of time, your skills start to deteriorate, which can cause workers to become more dependent on government support. So what I would say, in my opinion and at my suggestion, is if during a downturn in the economy you do lose your job, it's very important to try to find just something, whether it be a very minimal job or part-time or something. It's best to stay employed even if you're not employed at the same level, because it's a signal partially to future employers that, hey, even though during a downturn I did continue to work and pursue opportunities. So last thing I want to talk about is, again, is the Phillips curve actually reliable? And I just wanted to show you, I did graph out this graph for you using Fred data that I talked about to kind of show you it's really difficult to analyze the Phillips curve and draw a sound conclusion from it because it's kind of all over the place. There's not a clear relationship with it, especially even over the past decade. There hasn't been a clear relationship. There's been ups and downs. So with that being said, again, keep in mind all of these models are models and they are a simplified version of reality, going back to our very first chapter. And the point of them is to help analyze and improve understanding, but it's not necessarily going to be completely accurate all the time. So with that being said, I don't really have anything else I want to talk about in this chapter. Again, we're not being really tested over the relationship between short run and long run Phillips curve or expectations of inflation rate. I just talked about those. And then as far as Federal Reserve policy, this is not an economic history course, so I don't want to dive too much into that necessarily over time. But if you have further questions, comments, and concerns about this chapter, feel free to let me know. Thanks.